Well, first of all, welcome to Anthony Watts, who is perhaps one of the premier voices of the last couple of decades almost on this extremely tendentious issue of global climate change. First of all, sir, I'll just get a bit of a personal thing. How did you become attracted would be the wrong word, but what prompted you to become engaged in this furious topic?
Well, initially, I was on the other side of the issue. I believed that climate change was a real problem. In fact, in 1988, when it was first introduced by Dr. James Hansen of NASA in U.S. Congress, I watched that. Yeah, I watched it at the television station I was working at, and I believed we had a real problem. And I actually thought, well, we need to do something about it, and we need to work to mitigate climate change. And so I worked with the National Arbor Day Foundation on a tree planting program that was pushed by meteorologists all over the country on Earth Day in 1989 and also again in 1990. And so I was fully engaged that we had a problem.
Yeah.
But then I met the state climatologist of California, who had just retired from his position and moved to Chico, California, where I lived. And he started showing me some of his data.
Hmm.
And it made me start thinking, well, maybe this isn't as bad as what it's been made out to be. And the data he was showing me was that California's temperatures were almost exclusively controlled by the currents in the Pacific and the water temperature of the Pacific. He also showed me that some of the temperatures at weather stations around California used to monitor climate were badly skewed. And he showed me some hilarious examples of some poorly sited stations, such as Mount Hamilton, California, where they have an observatory, where they have scientists working. And the weather station there used to record the temperatures was right next to an incinerator. I was flabbergasted. I kid you not, I'm not making this up. And then in 1996, he published an article in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society that showed how counties in California, based on the population of these counties, the slope of warming was different. So very, very rural
Yeah.
counties had an almost flat warming slope, and very, very populated counties like Los Angeles County, San Bernardino County, and so forth, their slope was highly upward. And I
Yeah.
thought to myself, no, wait a minute, how can carbon dioxide know how to warm these counties differently? Something else is going on. And that was the light bulb moment for me.
Yeah. Okay. There's studies, is, again, slightly on the personal plane, and I will get to the actual substance of things in a minute. But I'm also, one of the things that's attracted my attention over the years is, as opposed to almost any other issue, there are a couple, but almost all other issues you can talk about, a dissent or a mildly collateral opinion or some small challenge, it receives such passionate and furious response. What's behind the anger of any second opinion on this topic? You must have experienced yourself, by the way, a hell of a
Well,
lot.
I think it's simply noble cause corruption. People believe they're doing something noble. We're saving the planet. We're saving the planet from ourselves. And therefore, our cause is just and righteous. It's just like a religion in some cases. Our religion is just and righteous.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's happening here. That's why there's so much venom and vitriol associated with the topic.
Yeah, there's another thing too. I mean, we can go back and pick any number. Arctic ice, the polar bears disappearing from the north. A better example, because it's such a high example, it got Oscar-winning awards and I think a Peace Prize for the person who put it out. If anybody looked at Gore's Inconvenient Truth today and had anything like a neutral and functioning mind, what would they think of it?
Well, people that are not versed in, the science would probably still accept most of it. I don't. The thing about inconvenient truth is that it's mostly about images. The
Yeah.
left uses images to their advantage in the global warming fight, and the images of drowning polar bears, the images of what it's going to look like in New York in 200 years, or things like that that they project are very powerful images. The difference between glaciers, for example, 100 years ago and now are powerful images. In fact, an interesting thing, there's just been a thing put out by NASA and Google saying we have these time lapses now that you can look at on Google Earth showing glaciers retreating. And one of the glaciers that they featured is the Columbia Glacier, which you may be familiar with, which is in Canada. And the Columbia Glacier, well, you can watch it retreat over 30 years. But if you zoom out the image just a little bit and go to wider view, there's several other glaciers around the periphery of the Columbia Glacier, and they're not changing hardly at all. So what's going on here? How does global warming know just to hit the Columbia Glacier and not the other ones?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It is a strange thing. And another, again, it's a general question. It's such a prodigious project. The idea that you're going to regulate by direct and indirect means the actual atmosphere of the Earth. You're going to do it at potentially great cost to the industries and the livelihood and the lifestyle that we presently have. And yet, it's not universal, but certainly among the Western population, Western politicians, they bend to this and they bend to it almost cravenly. This is such a vast experiment, even if true, that surely hesitation and caution would be the hallmarks of any sane response.
The problem is that it's trying to mitigate the atmospheric carbon dioxide that we already have and making it go down is sort of like the irresistible force meets the
Yeah.
immovable object. We really can't stop this freight train of emissions for a couple of reasons. Number one, the oceans are outgassing. As the Earth warms, the oceans are releasing carbon dioxide that they've stored for millions of years or thousands of years or whatever. And we really can't stop that. The amount of emissions that we produce is only about 4% of the whole total emissions budget. So it's just a tiny blip. And that's why when we had the COVID lockdown for the entire world, we saw no change in the atmospheric CO2 emissions rise. It went up at the exact same rate. There wasn't even a blip.
That's a really interesting. Just expand that a little bit for me. That's I it's obviously I'm a lazy person. I would have assumed that shutting down three-quarters of the world's economies would automatically mean, okay, this will be a good year for the global warming crowd, but obviously not.
Yes, and it's just simply because human emissions in the larger scheme of things is just such a small component. Over time, yes, it does add up, but in any given year, it's a small component. The variation that's caused by photosynthesis of plants in the northern hemisphere is actually larger than the human contribution. Plants do more to affect the drop in CO2 in any given year during seasonal changes than the emissions that humans produce do.
Well, it's on that basis. I'll ask you a question about my own country. My reading of the various statistics is that Canada has about 1.6% contribution to make to the overall so-called budget. And yet, Mr. Trudeau, in particular, because it's a very global warming government up here, he seems to think that putting great clamps on the Canadian economy, we're talking about carbon taxes at $170 a ton, that somehow or other this makes a contribution to staying the apocalyptic destruction of the earth from global. We're so small that even 1.6%, 10% of that, the Chinese government will outpace that particular thing in 6 hours. So what's the point of what he's doing if you're looking at it coldly?
I would say the point of doing it is to feel like you're contributing to part of the global club of things, the global Paris Climate Accord. I mean, I followed Mr. Trudeau, and he seems to be very much a popularist. He wants to be popular. He wants to be in the in crowd and so forth. And I really think that's all this is. And I'll be quite frank with you. If Canada shut down its entire economy, locked done everything, turned off all the factories, the cars, the generation plants, ever today, you wouldn't see any difference over the next year. It would be invisible. You wouldn't
This is
see any change.
that's my point. I mean, you don't have to be a partisan on this particular issue to realize that a small economy in a world in which the larger economies, your own, India, China, for different reasons, but you don't have a carbon tax, and India and China basically say we're not having anything to do with it if you listen to them whatsoever.
They pay
So,
lip service to it. They pay lip service to it. Say, oh, yes, we are going to reduce our emissions. But when you look at the data, and the data tells the real truth, the data shows that the emissions coming out of China, India, and other countries continues to climb, while the European Union and the United States and Canada see drops based on the way that they're changing their own economies and the way that they're fueling them. So, who's the chump here?
well, that's the point. On every other issue, any statement coming out of China now, I mean, speaking of the Chinese government, is not looked at skeptically. It's looked on almost in anger. But a promise from the communist government that by 2030 they'll have a look at things. Who would really want to believe that?
I just can't see anything that we're going to be able to do that's going to meet any of these goals. You just the scale associated with power generation is so large, and it's been set up over 100 years or more. Today, to take that and try to
Yeah.
reduce that in the scope of 15 years or 5 years or whatever it might be is a fool's errand. You just can't get there from here. And the bigger problem is that renewable energy, while it may be noble and it may, be earth saving and all that sort of thing, the bottom line is it's unreliable. You still have to have backup. You still have to have solid electrical generation at night or when the wind doesn't blow, for example. And as we saw last year in California, during
Yes.
the heat waves,
Yep.
right around sunset, when two things happen. The sun goes down and winds calm. They meteorologically reduce around sunset. Two things happen, and California's electrical grid all of a sudden didn't have enough renewable power to keep it going. It was within literally minutes of collapse, and they made some drastic changes and shut off power in some places to prevent it.
Yes.
So, how are we going to run an economy? How are we going to maintain a lifestyle on renewable energy? The answer is we can't. All we can use it as is a supplement, but we're still going to have hydroelectric, nuclear, and coal generation plants to keep the lights on at night.
I see that the President of the United States, I think it's today as I'm talking to you, which I believe is the holy feast of Earth Day, Mr. Biden has said that by 2030 now, the United States will reduce by 40%. Mr. Trudeau, having failed to meet his 2020 targets and ones that were set at 17% less than 2005, now he's going to go to 40 to 45% by 2030. How many times can you make these pledges and make these solemn declarations and miss the targets by so much, and then with an unblushed face go off to huge conferences and make another statement that you're going to do even more than you have done less now? I can't follow this.
It's a belief system. It's a belief that if we just do these things, we will solve this problem, or we just declare these things, and that's really all it is. The problem is that we have an electrical system that has been set up by electrical engineers, people that know physics and mechanics and power. But we've got politicians that are trying to redesign the electrical system that don't even have a clue about Ohm's law. They don't. And so
No.
they make these edicts, they make these predictions based on belief, thinking, well, we can just change things around. We can just switch the power to wind or to solar or whatever. But they don't really understand the basic physics behind power generation, and that's why this stuff fails.
I know it's the thing. Another one of the things that really oppresses me, I'm speaking intellectually only, is that up here, and I think down in your place too, and probably all over the world for all I know, I'm not as versed as you, that when they put on a carbon tax, it's actually carbon dioxide tax, which is ludicrous. The idea you can tax an element of the atmosphere strikes me as an insanity, but leave that alone. They don't want to call it that. They call it pricing pollution. So here we have probably the most insignificant gas on all the world. Nothing else would be here without CO2. and you're going to tax nature. How can they call this a price tag on a price on pollution? Is CO2 a pollutant?
Absolutely not. CO2 is part of the life cycle of Earth. It's part of who we are every day. As you and I are
Yes.
speaking here, we're emitting CO2. And that CO2 will be taken up by plants and it'll be converted back into oxygen. It's part of the life cycle. And in fact, one of the great benefits of the increased CO2 that we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years has been the fact that the Earth has started greening itself. NASA satellites have corroborated this again and again. They keep doing these measurements, and we've seen a surface area around the world go from brown to green, or no vegetation at all, to green, that's equivalent approximately to the surface area of the United States collectively over the last 30
Yeah.
to 40 years. And so is that a bad thing? I don't think so. I mean, the folks that say we need a greener environment seem to want to ignore the fact that we're actually getting a greener Earth as a side benefit of all this CO2. It's not a pollutant, but they try to make it a pollutant so they can demonize it.
Yeah, put a price on pollution. And as I say, when I translate that, they're saying, let us put a price on carbon dioxide. I mean, it's so transparent an evasion of what's there. In other words, what I'm hinting at is that certainly within the global warming crusade, they know they're deceiving. I mean, you cannot believe that particular thing, but they always have to brand it in a certain way. And when they make their errors, I can't get off this point. When we've shown that the polar bear population actually has increased dramatically, when the error is exposed, no one repents, and no one, and the news media in particular, seem collaborative in this. They'll knock you if you make a small statistical error, but the list of failed predictions and failed scenarios in this particular movement is almost infinite, and yet our glorious press and to some degree our universities, which I hold also responsible, walk by all of the mistakes, errors, and omissions.
Yes, and it goes right back to what I said. It's noble cause corruption. We're saving the planet, therefore we can forgive our own mistakes.
I think it may even go a little deeper. I'd like to hear you on this. We again, I understand the noble cause addiction. It makes people feel very important that they're saving the world as opposed to fixing their own backyard. Leave that aside. But underneath the umbrella of the global warming crusade, there are also a tremendous element of other kinds of politics. What's the dimension here? What's the proportion between the true believers? This is really what we're at here. We're trying to save the world. Leave them aside. What underneath that? What are the other agencies and organizations and motivations that support this campaign?
Well, I believe a lot of it has to do with empire building in the US government and in other governments around the world. The growth of government in terms of percentage over the
Yeah,
last 30, 40 years has basically paralleled the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And although there's not necessarily a correlation, the point is that bureaucracy keeps growing to manage this problem. And so, once you create bureaucracy and you fund bureaucracy,
yeah,
it's almost impossible to get rid of it, even if the problem doesn't exist anymore, or even if the problem turns out to be not an issue. And we've got like the US EPA, which has done really good and wonderful things since its inception around 1970 by the Nixon administration. But now they're looking
yeah.
for a new targets. They've solved all the really big problems. Our air is cleaner. Los Angeles hasn't got the smog it used to have. Cities around the United States' rivers are cleaner. The Great Lakes are cleaner. All of these things have improved. And yet the agency still exists in order to, solve problems. So they keep looking for new problems to solve. And this global warming thing is the newest, biggest problem to solve. It's also one of the greatest funded problems in the world. There are huge amounts of money. It's big business. There's a common misconception that climate skeptics like myself are funded by big
Yeah.
oil or the Koch brothers or whatever. Well, I'll be quite frank with you, and I want to say this for the record right here. I've never gotten a dime from the Koch brothers, Shell Oil, Mobil, or any of these companies. They have no idea who I am. Never even had a letter, nothing. And if we did have those kinds of monies, certainly it would be well known, but it's just nothing but accusations. And it's basically a projection to save their own
Yeah.
empire building.
Well, That's you've hit another point that isn't, I don't think, present in the consciousness of very many people. I see it as a reverse David Goliath effect. We all know the oil companies, they're the villains in all of this, are prodigiously powerful. They have prodigious amounts of money. However, in terms of the expertise in conducting a public quarrel, in terms of how to counter attacks on their own proper activities, they are feeble. In many cases, they are amateur. And I'll say the hardest thing, a hell of a lot, speaking here of Canada, a hell of a lot of the really big companies are also cowards. They want to
Hmm.
devour their own situation. We have statements here of private meetings within the energy industry talking about, oh, maybe we should go for net zero. Where is this? Where does this come from that everyone bends so quickly to what I
It's
see as a
fear.
travesty?
It's fear. The folks who are activists are very good at making noise, very good at making threats, very good at providing shaming arguments. And as a result, a lot of companies simply cave to fear. They don't want to have their brand tarnished by this bad press. And so they cave.
I talked earlier with Judith Curry, whose name I know you know, and she pointed out another, I think, sad part of this story is that at the intellectual level, at the university level, at the technical level, people, especially young people, who decide to pursue some line of science in this terrain, they basically, if they wish to prosper or if they wish to have station within the intellectual community, they better be on the right side of this. I thought our democracies were mature enough to realize that you can talk, you can speak, you can argue, and certainly you can research. You can research in utter neutrality, and you will be praised and applauded from all sides. But not on this issue. If you want to
No.
get somewhere on the environmental bulletin board, you better be on one. Secondly, we're choking off the possibility of getting counterfacts, real ones, that should participate. Intellectual decline is not a good thing to watch. It's even worse when it's imposed.
That's true. Basically, what we've got here is tribalism, pure and simple. If you're not part of the tribe that believes that climate change is a huge, significant problem that must be solved at all costs, then you're against us, and that's it.
Yeah, but it's very. I could see that in tyrannical circumstances and in controlled governments, but but surely the West, and I include Europe in that, has for almost 200 years been celebrating the fact that, having thrown off some of the impediments to thought and inquiry and just observation, that at this stage in the game, 2021, we declare such things. This is the paradox of all paradoxes, that the science is settled. That's an ignorant statement, not a wrong statement.
It had to do with the fact that science has become beholden to government funding. President Eisenhower, when he gave his famous farewell address,
Yeah,
when he warned about the military
right.
industrial complex, well, there was that warning. And then in the very next paragraph, he talks about the the concern he had for science being funded by the government. And this is because of World War II and the atomic bomb and all the research money that got thrown at
Yeah.
that. The government now became the single most common source of funding for science. And so science is now beholden to the government. And since the government believes that global warming, aka climate change, is an issue that needs to be solved, it's now connected to all the grants. And so if you don't toe the line and go down that path of research, you know, you're not going to get the grants. And where else do you turn to these days? And that's pretty much it.
You've participated, as I said, as one of the main actors in at least offering an alternative scenario, or at least giving some contest to the broadest generalizations that have massive implications for economies and governments. After your long participation in this, where are you now mentally? Do you see this as a juggernaut that really can't be retarded? And is the propagandization of a climate apocalypse been so efficient that we're going to ride it out until it bankrupts us all?
Well, here's my viewpoint. Yes, global warming, aka climate change, is happening and has happened. Is it a crisis? No. We've had a mild warming over the last century, which accounts to about 1.5 degrees centigrade, and yet we have not seen catastrophic issues associated with this. There are claims of catastrophic issues such as sea level rise. For example, they talk about Miami and Baltimore, but those are due mostly to subsidence. Baltimore sits on an old meteor crater and the rock is crushed from the meteor impact, and it's very, very slowly compressing. In Miami, they're withdrawing water from the water table for drinking water and other purposes. And so the earth is shrinking there. It's dropping. Sea level rise is not overwhelming those cities, but subsidence is. So,
Hmm.
but those kind of arguments get distorted by the media and activists. And so they turn these into climate apocalypse. They do that to scare you because scary stories are far more motivating to people than, we might see an inch of sea
Yeah.
level rise in 100 years. Okay. That you can't change people's behavior or control people unless you make it scary. Fear is the greatest motivator for change in any human society.
I also wonder. By the way, your point there is extremely correct. The main thrust of most climate issues has always been, oh, this is an existential crisis. I'm quoting real words. This is the end of the planet as we know it. This is an extinction event. These things trotted out as almost like you were saying tomorrow it will rain because they've done it so often and so commonly. But at the same time, I wonder is there a division? The clerisy, the news media, the blog world, the universities, the higher civil servants. At that level, all seems to be unanimous. I wonder, though, if the general population, if there's is a great severance here, that despite all of this and all their power and expertise in persuasion, that what we'll call the person who walks the street alone, he's not buying this. That somehow there's been a hesitation, despite all of the effort that's gone in from their point, for normal people to say it's okay.
Well, if you look at most of the polls, including a UN poll that's been running now for 10 years, only about half of the people really consider this to be a problem that you would, define as an existential threat or, like a world-ending kind of a thing. It's just not that extreme to people. The problem is that people aren't completely as dumb as some politicians think they are. When you go look at what the politicians who've been saying, well, we have to make these changes do, for example, Al Gore or Barack Obama and many others, they live in seaside,
Yes.
resort type homes. Well, if sea level rise is such an issue, why are you living there? They can't explain that, nor will they even take a question about it. So the hypocrisy is on display. And the bottom line is that climate change is a very, very, very slow moving thing. And it doesn't capture people's attention, um, you
Yeah.
know, like it's a threat to you today. It's not going to Climate change is not going to kill you today or next week or next year or even 10 years from now, and probably not even 100. Well, you'll be dead in 100 years, but the point is that it's a very, very slow moving threat. And the bottom line is that most people can't even detect it. If you put people into, let's say, uh, a room that was at 68 degrees
Yeah.
uh, Fahrenheit, all right, 20 degrees Celsius. You put them in a room, and then you say, okay, I'm going to send you over there into this room, and this other room is 1.5 degrees warmer. Most people would not be able to tell the difference. They can't detect the change in temperature. And so it's just really, it doesn't bring the hackles up. It doesn't create that fight or flight response. The only thing that does are these scary stories.
I got just two more points, and I will release you from this terror here. One of the things also that captures my attention, you pointed out the hypocrisy when you have these great so-called COP climate change summits, and you have upwards of 40,000 people attending them at their best, and they've got to build new airports for all the private jets that are flying. That's true. The number of private planes in one of them, I can't remember them now, there's so damn many, but they didn't have enough space for the privately owned jet aircraft that the global warming community. Hypocrisy doesn't register in this one. But there's another thing, and I get your comment on this. Of all the elements in this particular crusade that are most attractive to politicians, I mentioned Mr. Trudeau pledging now 40% by 2030. Of all the things is, every promise is so far out in the future that none of the protagonists in this discussion are ever going to have to stand up and explain why it didn't happen. It is the most convenient issue in the world because they can talk about 2100 when on any other issue, a politician who promises something 3 days from now is looked at with wary eyes and skepticism. But I can tell you we're going to save the world in 2100. Oh, applause, applause, give me another grant.
Right. No one alive today will be around in 2100 to verify that prediction came true.
Well, here's my last thing to you as a kind of a summary thing. Because it's penetrated so deeply into the governments, the politics, the bureaucracies, the universities, the newspapers, are the more prosperous nations of this world in some danger of impoverishing themselves and battering the communities and the style that took generations to build. This is not just an unemotive or disinterested business. If you follow the prescriptions that are being offered, and if they actually do go renewable, and if they have to rebuild an entire grid, and if you decide to let China race ahead while you do all of these things, is there not a danger that we will deconstruct, to use a trendy term, or impoverish our present standards?
It is definitely something that is more concerning to me than the climate change, aka global warming itself. The fact is if you look at what's happened with the original um, environmental policies put out by the Nixon administration, the EPA, what happened is most of the companies involved and that were actually doing real pollution, some of them cleaned up their act, but a good majority of them simply moved the jobs and manufacturing
Yes.
overseas. And that's exactly what's happening here again. So to avoid carbon taxes, we're
Yeah.
going to see companies moving out of the country. And so that's going to mean, we're going to have a lower gross domestic product, higher unemployment, all those other kinds of problems. And so our infrastructure, our way of life is going to be impacted by these things while it benefits other companies that are just simply paying lip service to this whole thing.
Well, sir, again, I'll stop it now because I don't want to trespass too much on your time, but I'll end it by a couple of things. As I say at the beginning, your blog, What's Up With That, is a most valuable instrument in this challenging time. And I suppose I would be remiss if I didn't wish you a happy Earth Day.
Well, thank you very much.
You
I
take care of
appreciate
yourself.
that.
No, I
Likewise,
appreciate you
it's been a
giving me
pleasure
the
to be
time,
with
sir.
you.
Pleasure to
All
meet
righty.
with you, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye.